Hello, everybody. This is Droll. We're going to read today, or I should say a portion. We're going to read a portion today of the Dictionary Celtic Myth and Legend by Miranda J. Green. And there's some topics in here that kind of want to touch base on. Some of the topics I brought up in my book, which you might have seen my video of, a preview of my book. I kind of feel like all of this, from where I put the bookmark at to later on in the book, has to do with essentially Celtic myth and the aspects of it. From what we know from Ireland and Wales to what we know from the Iron Age and earlier period of the Celts. What do we mean by the term the Celts? The problem is that Celts and Celtic are widely used terms, which can mean different things to different people. The Celts, who are the subject of this book, are the ancient peoples of pagan Celtic Europe from about 700 BC to 400 AD. So, in the present context, the words Celt and Celtic are used to describe and identify the huge group of pre-Christian communities living in much of Europe, from the north to the Alps at the time of their communities' maximum geographical expansion, 4th to 3rd century BC. The Celts occupied a vast area which stretched from, well, this is actually kind of backwards. It would be from Spain to Ireland. It wouldn't be Ireland to Spain, because it would have been Spain, Portugal, Escahela, French, and then Belgium, the Netherlands, Denmark. All that would be earlier than what we know from the groups that went into Britain and so forth. In the west to Eastern Europe. I just lost my place for a minute. Hold on, I'll get there. These pagan Celtic communities are identified by the evidence of classical literature and linguistics and archaeology. The scope of the dictionary does not embrace the broader sense of the term Celtic. Thus, such subjects as the Celtic saints, illuminated manuscripts, and Arthurian romance are not included. Modern Celtic culture, as found in the Arthurian romance, are not included. Yeah, I said that. Okay. Modern Celtic culture, as found in the present day Wales, Scotland, and Ireland, is likewise outside the scope of this book. So basically, what we're going to get into is the earlier Celtic stuff. There are many difficulties to be faced in to define the ancient Celts. These are mostly concerned with the different kinds of evidence which are employed to identify these people. We first hear of Celtic people in the writings of such Greek historians such as Hecaticus, who alluded to Celtoi in about 500 BC, which was also brought up by Barry Cunliffe as well. Herodotus could mention the Celts in his histories, for example. We have to ask the question of what those Greek and Roman authors who described the Celts actually meant when they used the term. We also need to pose the question of whether the Celts recognized themselves as such, since pagan Celts did not write about themselves. They did and they didn't. Um, they do have stuff that does sound like scriptures or stuff that sounds like the name of gods or goddesses, but there's so much that we have to rely with archaeology and linguistics and writing from other people, such as the Greek and Romans, as well as what we know from this period and how that falls into place with the earlier Celts. If they thought themselves as Celtic, was there then a Celtic ethnic consciousness and inequality? For the classical authors, the term Celtic referred to a broad geographical description in some manner or other. There must have been, sufficient unity in material culture and perhaps also in language and the great groups of people living in much of non-Mediterranean Europe, other to be identified with a common name by their classical neighbors, whereas there was considerable diversification within this group of communities. There must equally be considerable okay, I read that part. Have been abroad cultural and or linguistic features which were shared. Now it's really hard to tell who the earlier Celts were, though we could probably think about all of the farmers from the Neolithic times to the Indo-European migrations to who maybe could have impacted who they were. From what we know language-wise, the languages that we know of from an earlier Celtic time, it would have started in Spain and Portugal, and it seemed like it worked its way up into what was called Gaul, as well as Hallstatt. So at one point, the Celtic languages, it is believed that the Celts would be able to speak to each other, even if their language isn't exactly the same, and they would be able to understand what each other was saying. Mm-hmm. Are you going a real walk now? Mom, you don't have to go to the bathroom now. On linguistics and seeking the origins of the ancient Celts, both archaeological and linguistic evidence need to be considered. The early linguistic evidence for the Celts consists of inscripts, which I did bring up. Maybe I should just keep reading. Inscripts, coins, and legends and the names given to people and places in the classical literary sources. All these sources date from the last few centuries BC, and together they demonstrate that by the time of the Roman occupation at the end of the first millennium BC, Celtic languages were spoken in Britain, Gaul, North Italy, Spain, Central and Eastern Europe. And if you ever read the book The Ancient Celts by Barry Conlife, it would be second edition. He also brought up the Celts also traveling to places like Egypt as well. That they were in Egypt as well. There's also evidence of them going down to Africa, which is also taught in Spain, which is one of the reasons why I believe that they came down from ancient Hispania and traveled the Iberians to their multicultural. It's it's hard to say. There's scholars out there who say there's Iberians in separate groups. There'd be Iberians who were separate people who had cultures from Africa and the Mediterranean and Iran. And then there was a group of Iberians that adopted culture from the Celts who settled in Hispania. Um, so that's the hypothesis, anyway. For Wales and Ireland, the linguistic evidence is later. The earliest major source for Ireland occurs in Ptolemy's linguistics. Wait, Ptolemy's geography dating from the 2nd century AD. So, sometime between the 2nd century AD, it's all speculated 500 AD, 400 AD, even as early as the Cantabrian Wars, which is during the BC period, that the Celts from Hispania and Portugal has traveled to Ireland. Which it also brings that up in this book too, how there's a stone, which actually I brought up in one of my blogs. There's a stone in Ireland um, that has Latin style art that also resembles the same kind of Celtic art that it's believed that depicts of Scotland later on adapted. It's believed by a lot of people that the ancient Picts were a combination of Celts from ancient Britain that moved up the way up into Scotland, crossed over into Ireland, but even before that, they had other type of European genes, Indo-European genes, as well as Indo-Aryan genes. Um, it is believed that they were Scythians or Scythians. And the Scythians, they originally started in India, then they went into the Middle East, then you had some tribes, expand into Asia, and further into Europe outside of Turkey. So that's part of the different migrations, which I also speculate because you can see similarities in some languages that you can find in India, like some sounds, as well as Albania. Um, Hindi sounds and spellings, like CH and BH and DH, TH. Yeah. But, um, but have already seen classical writers refer to the Celts from about 500 BC. It is the archaeological evidence which appears to corroborate these literary references to an identifiable series and culturally related communities. So basically, the Celts in ancient times, right? Everything fit together: language, culture, and mythology. Now, this is part of what inspired my book, Celtic Mythology Explained, is that the definition of Celts and what separate them from other peoples that the Romans and Greeks ran into was their mythology, their language, their culture was the same, okay? With some minor differences, such as clothing. The clothing may be differences. Not all Celts wore kilts. Not all Celts probably wear plaid. Some wore pants and tunics. Some, um, You could even say the helmets were different too in the regions, but the main concept was language, culture, and mythology. Um, that's what we know. Living north of the Alps, about the second half of the first millennium BC, the so-called Latin period. Hmm. However, the material culture of much of the non-Mediterranean Europe indicates that the origins of the European Celts may be sought somewhat earlier than the 5th century BC. A study of the archaeological remains of later continental prehistory suggests that the historical Celts, those known from written sources, had their roots within the later Bronze Age cultures, non-Mediterranean Europe. Indeed, the Celts were the lineal descendants. And we're back. I just want to apologize in advance. My camera stopped working. Anyway, so where was I? Talking about Eastern Mediterranean, um, the communities of the Alps, the so-called Latin period, which we could see them. Okay, so basically, Celts could be traced back all the way to the Neolithic farmers, which is true. There's some groups that are believed to have been a prime sus- suspect, or no, would suspect be the correct word? Contestant, the prime contestant to the Bronze Age and Iron Age Celts. Um, which that can be another video I can talk about later. Sorry about that. Anyway, so she brings up con life. Okay, I've kind of already went over that. Uh, Archaeology can provide things such as weapons, warfare, basically give you an idea of what the ancient Celts lived like. Um, what else? As well as the classical writers. I'm gonna get to, as well as some of the mythology, such as writing, or if you've seen the Gunstrip Cauldron, that shows some of the mythology. Um, Here we go. It is. Yes, this stone right here, carved granite pillar, is decorated with Latin designs which dated from the 1st century BC from Turlough County, Galway, Ireland. 1st century BC, like I said, that would be around the time of the Cantabrian Wars. So that means the Irish would have even settled in Ireland before the written mythological story of the Celts of Iberia traveling into Ireland. So it's estimated anywhere between 500 AD and 1st century BC. If I could show you right here, Oop. This stone right here, which I did talk about in one of my blogs. There's also a shield, and there is a ball that was found in Switzerland that is believed to be Celtic. The evidence of Irish and Welsh literature. The Irish oral tradition began first to be preserved and written from the 6th century AD. However, only a few fragments of the manuscript survive. From a time earlier than 1100, most of the earliest extant of manuscripts were compiled during the 12th century by Christian monks, which is why we really have to study it, which is why what we know from today's Irish mythology and Welsh mythology would have to align with what we know of Gaulish mythology, which was written by the Greeks and Romans in the names of their deities, as well as stuff like Basque mythology, as well as Cantabrian mythology, and the Hispanic gods of Iberia and Portugal. Once you see that pattern, you truly know what the Celts believed in, what deities they worshipped, and who was what without these gods or these deities being switched around. And it gets very confusing at first until you know what you're looking for. There's the Book of Invasions, which is very, very Christian. But it does talk about the mythology a bit. Um, let's see here. There's the Irish Dissecting, which I also brought up in my book. Um, yeah, I'll talk about the Mills, the Malaysians or Gaels coming in Ireland. Um, and then, of course, Irish mythology. It has the King of Connacht. It has Connacht Cernach. It has Maeve. All those characters would be later on added characters from the medieval period. You wouldn't find these figures in Iberian mythology, Portuguese mythology, Gaulish mythology, or even the mythology found in Britain. Um, those names are kings or queens or characters found in Ireland that are believed to have been either kings or queens. And that's pretty much the end of it.